Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. Day 9 of testimony in the Chad Daybell trial. We're at lunch break. I'm doing these half episodes because it makes it a lot easier for me, and a lot of you guys like having these to watch on your lunch break if you're working and can't watch. So I think I'll be doing this and going live at breaks instead of a whole lunch. We're going to dive right in. But first, before we get started, you know the drill. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video, share it with your friends, and you can ring my bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Click that little bell icon. Music fact of the day, my favorite female singer of all time, Patsy Cline. I Fall to Pieces, one of her most famous songs, was actually turned down by Brenda Lee. She felt it was too country. Well, Patsy Cline overheard this conversation and asked if she could record the song. At first, Patsy Cline thought it was too pop, but it was the only way the song worked, and the rest is history. Reminds me of dancing and singing with my grandmother in the living room as a kid. When we left off yesterday, David Warwick was still on cross-exam. He picked back up this morning. Let's go through and finish up his testimony. David testified at Chad's preliminary hearing, and Pryor asked if he talked to his wife or the prosecution about his testimony, and he said no. Pryor says yesterday that David testified that Chad was kind, meek, and humble. Through all of his interactions, David said he found Chad to be deeply religious. We know David didn't agree with all of Chad's religious beliefs and vice versa, but they did have a mutual respect. Pryor asked if he participated in seances with his wife, Melanie Gibb. He says no. He asked about the 7 gatherers and asked if he had any knowledge of this, and he says no. I have a theory. The 7 gatherers are Chad, Lori, Alex, Gibb, Melanice, David Warwick, and Zulema, as far as Pryor is concerned. Not sure about David Warwick, but he's asking him. So I'm just curious if maybe David's included in that. But from everything we've learned, it doesn't seem David was really in deep with this group like Melanie Gibb was. He brings up that David lives in a different state than his wife Gibb, and he asked how long they've lived separately. And he said around 2 years now. They did live together for months after they were married. Pryor asked if they got married to avoid testifying against each other in a criminal proceeding. David said no. And just to note, I'm pretty sure in Idaho, there is no spousal immunity if murders involve children. So if they all got married for that reason, it was a bad reason because I don't think it's even valid there. He asked how he met with Chad that Saturday if David Warwick went to that whole conference. He points out Melanie Gibb said she was there for hours taking photographs. Warwick said he just doesn't remember how long he stayed at the conference. Pryor asked how Chad met with him at the park that day if he was at church. David's like, I don't know what you're getting at. Pryor said, you told investigators he came right from church. Then Pryor asked, isn't it true you didn't see him on Friday or Saturday? David said he did see him on Friday, and that was the end of cross. On a redirect, the prosecution says they did meet and discuss his testimony, and Warwick says a couple of months ago. They ask if he talked to law enforcement about whether or not he liked Chad, and David said he was struggling with Chad approaching him about doing a book. David told Chad he would need to see if it was right for him. But for the next year, when Chad reached out, he didn't acknowledge David's concerns about waiting to see if this is what he needed to do. Chad just wanted to go forward with David writing a book under Chad's book company. They give him a report to review what he said from June 3rd, 2020. He was angry that Chad called Gibb and told her not to talk to the police. He said when someone makes a call like that, something's wrong. He said at the time the call came through, he personally was on the phone with his mother who had cancer, while Gibb was on the phone with Chad. When they could talk, he said Gibb was upset and quiet about the conversation she had with Chad. This is the one he told her not to talk to law enforcement. David told Detective Hermosillo that Chad was manipulative and all his interactions with Chad were being kind and meek. But after the call to Gibb, he said that showed him a different side of Chad. He told Gibb in a voice of authority not to talk to police. Chad told David Tammy was healthy, and David was asking about his marriage to her. Chad said she was going to be passing away at a young age. So David asked Chad about her health, and Chad said she was healthy. On a recross, they talk about Tammy's health. That conversation took place the day you were at the seminar on Saturday. He says yes. Pryor says you were aware Chad made that revelation before he met Lori as far as Tammy dying young. David said he did not hear that. Pryor points out you've never been charged in this case. And then he also says the day and evening JJ was murdered, you and your wife were at Lori's house that night. Yes. That was the end of recross. He is subject to recall from Pryor. The next witness, Brandon Boudreaux, the ex-husband of Melanice. He has since remarried. He was married to Melanice for 10 years. They had 4 children together. Their current ages are 14, 10, 8, and 7. Melanice has remarried. Her current last name is Pulowski, and she has had a child with her new husband, Ian. He met the Cox family obviously because he was marrying Melanice. They took trips with her family, and they spent a lot of time with Lori and Charles. They often would take Tylee and JJ to Disneyland with all their kids. Brandon's son and daughter bonded with JJ. His son's just a couple of years older. But when JJ was younger, Brandon said he was nonverbal for a while and had tons of energy, but just didn't know how to use that energy. So when JJ was coming over, they would have to prepare their house for him to make it safe. And as he grew, JJ learned to talk and he would rephrase things over and over. He would always want to play with his cousins. He knew Tylee from the time she was a child up until she was murdered. He said she was a typical teen. She would want to be alone at times, and then sometimes she would open up. Tylee would babysit his kids, and he said Tylee had good motherly instincts. He said Tylee was very protective of JJ, and in fact, Brandon was the one that baptized Tylee. He saw Lori and Melanice's relationship over the years as very mother-daughter. Melanice's mom died at a young age, and Melanice was very influenced by Lori. Melanice wanted to be like Lori and always was looking for Lori's acceptance. Brandon had a great relationship with Charles. They had similar personalities. They both loved working. They both owned businesses. He said Charles had a producer mentality. He said Lori and Chad rented their homes and they did move often. Brandon and Melanice would travel to Hawaii to see them when they were there. And then they lived close in Arizona, so they saw each other frequently. They spent major holidays together. The last Christmas they all spent together was in 2018, but it was different. He said in 2018, our families were changing. At that time, he was not aware of everything that was going on with Lori. He said, normally you feel very welcome, loved, and can pick up where you left off. But that Christmas, there was a distance there. And usually it was just family, but Melanie Gibb was at that Christmas gathering that year. Brandon did not know her, and he said it was just odd to have a stranger there, and there wasn't much conversation. He said Lori was a doting person. She would make Brandon's kids feel very loved. She would spoil them with presents and attention. But that Christmas, it didn't happen. Melanice and Lori's interactions were different, and he told her that when they left that night. Melanice said it didn't seem different to her. Brandon and Melanice were very active in their church, and they shared religious activities with Lori and Charles. In fall of 2018, Melanice started to get very excited about religion and going to church and wanted to go to temple every day. He said temple is important to their faith. It's a process of reminding yourself of the promises you made to God. He said it's normal to go around once a month. It's really rare for somebody to go daily, especially when you have kids at home and you have other responsibilities. Lori also was going to temple daily, by the way. He wanted to be supportive of Melanice and help her figure things out. Melanice was going to these meetings at people's houses that were not under the direction of the LDS church, and it concerned him. One time, she wanted him to buy $10,000 of food storage all at once to prepare for the end of the world. And he said that just didn't seem practical to him. She had a fascination with Jesus and wanted to know if he had a family and why James was named James the Beloved. He would share perspective with her, trying to get her back on the right track. He shared things he learned from his mission with her, that people got focused on things that were far away from their mainstream teachings, and that led to them falling away from the core of their faith. He didn't attend any of these conferences or meetings. One time he did ask if he could go see just what was going on, but Melanice told him he was not welcome to join. Initially, Melanie's was invited by Lori to start coming to these meetings and conferences. By the fall and the winter of 2018, Melanie's was changing. It was the beginning of a new year, and there was a period where Lori sent messages to the family telling them that Charles was cheating. She took all of his money out of the bank, stole his truck, changed the locks on the house. Initially, Brandon didn't know about all this because Melanie's blocked Charles's number from his phone, and Lori didn't tell him about her accusations against Charles. He said everybody in the family was drug into all the drama and it was very messy. Charles did not want that to happen. And he would send emails to the group to communicate, to beg people to help Lori. She left Charles with JJ and disappeared. Brandon said he didn't want to take a side. He loved Lori and Charles both. Melanie said she was uncomfortable with Charles and asked Brandon essentially to pick a side. Brandon said he did his best, but he wanted to stay married because that was important to him. He did not see Lori in early 2019, but he knew she had left for that period of time. He did see Charles a few times during that time frame she was gone. Charles would bring JJ to play with his kids. Brandon said JJ and his son would play video games and that JJ would bounce from one thing to another. His son knew that JJ was special needs and was very good at keeping an eye on him and keeping him safe. He said JJ was super fast. They had to put stoppers on the doors to keep JJ from running outside when he was over there. Brandon would sit and talk to Charles about what he was going through, and Charles did not want the divorce or to be separated from Lori. Charles was distraught, sad, and overwhelmed. They did try to reconcile, and at one point, we know Charles stopped those divorce proceedings. And Charles would always say he wanted to make it work. Brandon went to Melanie's family's house for a marriage that was taking place on that side of the family. While he was there, Brandon's grandfather died of a heart attack. His dad got a phone call while they were in the church. Brandon waited for a day or two and then finally got word of when the funeral would take place. And he asked Melanie's to come to the funeral with him, and she said no. But Brandon wanted his whole family to be there. He said the conversation escalated into a conversation that made absolutely no sense to him. Melanie's brought Lori into the argument, which had nothing to do with what they were talking about. That argument was an accusation that Brandon had hacked into Lori's computer. Melanie's accused him of it and told Brandon he had to admit to it. It had nothing to do with what Brandon was talking to her about, which was the death of his grandfather. She accused him of that, but never told him why she thought he would hack into Lori's computer. And of course, Brandon did not hack Lori's computer. She informed Brandon that God revealed to her that he was gay and that he hacked into Lori's computer. He said the argument ended after a long time. It started in late afternoon, didn't end until 11 or 12 that night. He was frustrated, and he sent a text to both Charles and Lori that night saying that he was frustrated, and if his marriage was over, it was on them. Lori didn't respond, but Charles did, and they spoke on the phone. Charles apologized, and Brandon apologized, saying that he was sorry for not being there for him when his marriage was falling apart because now he knew how it felt. He said Charles was very gracious about it, and that was the last time Brandon ever spoke to Charles. After Charles's murder, he had no contact with JJ or Tylee. And after the murder, he and Melanie's got divorced. He said that process started right after his grandfather's funeral. He moved her into a rental house, and that divorce was finalized in October of 2019. Brandon got a rental home as well. Their house sold in September. It was a very quick process. It was close to where they had lived, and he wanted stability for the kids to try to stay in the same area. They were sharing custody of the kids at the time, but Melanie stopped talking to him. They would text, but she was very cold to him. Moving forward to October 2nd, that's the day Alex Cox tried to shoot and kill Brandon. He woke up and got his kids ready for school, dropped the older ones off at school, dropped one at preschool, and then gave the baby to Melanie's, and Brandon went to the gym. As he was coming home, he saw a Jeep parked on the edge of the driveway with its bumper right up against a van that was also on the road. The Jeep had a Texas license plate. There was no tire on the back of the Jeep, and it just looked awkward to Brandon. The back window of that Jeep raises up, and he sees a silencer come out, and then here's the shot. He could not see anyone inside, but his window ultimately shattered, He pushed the gas and just drove straight. He drove to where the street ended and called 911. He was parked in front of a community pool. He saw the Jeep do a U-turn, and so he went to follow it. 911 told him to park his car in front of his house and just wait for police. He did recognize those Texas license plates on that Jeep. He had only been in that house for days. Melanie's allowed him to have the kids sooner than she was supposed to. So he had to tell her when he moved and where. And also, just a couple of close friends of his knew where he was living. So somebody had to tell Alex where Brandon was. You do the math. Law enforcement showed up and he told him everything he could remember. He described the Jeep and he provided the VIN number of the Jeep to law enforcement the day of the shooting. He identified that Jeep in a photo as Tylee's Jeep that Charles co-signed with her. Remember, we learned last week Tylee was making those payments. I believe when they seized the Jeep in Idaho, that VIN number was gone, by the way. But Brandon told investigators who he thought did it and why. He said it took him a little while to realize an arrest and a resolution was not coming as quick as he wanted. So he started to try to find things to help investigators figure out this whole situation and who shot at him. That included hiring a private investigator and going back through emails Charles sent to the whole family when this drama was going on with him and Lori. He sent a lot of emails with his concerns about her mental health. Brandon was looking for more information on their beliefs, so maybe he could figure out what was going on because everything was just so bizarre. In one of the emails from Charles, there was mention of Chad Daybell sending information to Lori about light and dark spirits, including rating Brandon as a dark spirit, as well as ratings on Lori's families. There were also invitations to firesides that were not in line with LDS teachings that he found. He gave all those emails to law enforcement. Charles mentions in an email, and this was not testified to today, that Lori calls her own daughter a dark spirit and says to help her. Brandon started Googling Chad because he didn't know him. That's where he found Tammy's obituary, and Brandon was shocked. He gave that information to his private investigator as well as law enforcement. In the process of all this is when they learned Tylee and JJ are missing. Brandon was worried about this early on and told Detective Pillar his concerns over the kids. He heard they found the kids' bodies through a phone call on June 9th, 2020. Brandon was at his parents' house. Someone from Rexburg called him. The next day was his wedding, so he got married, but he felt he should go to Rexburg. He drove all night long and identified JJ's body so Kay and Larry would not have to. He did that at an FBI location near Pocatello. He thinks around June 11th or the 12th. He was shown a series of photographs. He recognized that as JJ, and on the stand, he gets very emotional and cries. On cross, Pryor says, "You mentioned contact with Charles and Lori frequently." He asked how often he met up with Charles from when they first met to when he died. He said it varied by the year. Sometimes they lived close, so they'd see each other weekly. But sometimes Charles traveled a lot, so they may not see each other for a couple of months. Brandon met Lori in 2008. Pryor asked if Lori would move and then Alex would follow her. Brandon said sometimes. He said they all moved from Texas to Arizona together, but for example, Alex did not move to Hawaii when Lori, Charles, JJ, Tylee, and for some of it, Colby moved over there. They talk about when Lori left JJ with Charles for 2 months and disappeared. He says Tylee and JJ were very close. And Pryor says, "Isn't it true Tylee was a second mother to JJ?" Brandon said it depended. She was a teenager, so it wasn't always the case, but she did love him. But it wasn't her primary responsibility. Pryor asked if JJ relied on Tylee for things that Lori wasn't providing. Brandon says JJ was special needs and he needed every adult there to help him. He said, "I remember he missed his mom a lot when Lori left, and he said it broke your heart to hear how sad he was." We know after Lori got back from her days of being gone, there was an attempted reconciliation. Pryor asked, "Did Charles confide in you that Lori asked him to make her the beneficiary on that life insurance policy?" Brandon said Charles never talked to him about his life insurance policy. Speaking of Melanie Gibb, Pryor's favorite person to talk about, he said, "You found it was unusual. She was there for Christmas. Were you aware she was planning all of these events meaning the conferences and these talks they would go to at people's houses, and he wasn't. They talk about sealings, and he says you can be sealed where you would be married for eternity. Brandon says you can stand in for someone who has passed away and baptize them. You're essentially like a proxy for that person. Brandon personally doesn't know anybody who has visions. And Pryor asked if Melanice was engaging in seances. He does not know. Pryor asks if he is familiar with vibrations. And again, Brandon doesn't know. Pryor says you talked about Chad and light and dark. He says that's not inconsistent with your faith. It talks about it in publications. Brandon says we don't talk about light or dark spirits. It's not what I've been taught. He said, I've been going to this church a long time and I've never experienced it. Up next, Detective Ryan Pillar, the Gilbert PD lead detective on the investigation into Brandon's shooting. A projectile hit the vehicle on the upper door frame near the windshield, which caused that windshield to shatter. He got a description from Brandon and witnesses who also saw that gray-colored Jeep Wrangler with no rear tire. Detective Pillar learned of Charles's murder and contacted Chandler PD. The significance was family members of Melanice's were present at the shooting of Charles, and also the Jeep was at the house the day Charles was shot and killed, and there are photos of that in the evidence from Charles's murder. They started to develop a suspect, which was Alex Cox. They tracked his movements in the Jeep from Arizona to Idaho from just prior to and after the shooting. They knew the Jeep traveled from Rexburg, and so they reached out to local law enforcement in Idaho. They got a search warrant on the Jeep, and then we know that Jeep was found at the townhomes. The search warrant was executed November 18th of 2019. They did DNA swabs, took items from the Jeep, and did the gunshot residue tests in the back of the Jeep, since that's where the shot was fired from. Alex was laying down. Again, I'll link that video I did in the description showing why that rear tire had to be off in order for Alex to lift that window. It's the same tire you see Lori and Chad and Lori and Alex putting in and out of her storage unit there in Rexburg. The investigation shifted to the kids in late November. He said November 26th was when the focus changed. In Arizona, they began interviewing family members of all the parties, and they set up these poll cams where family members lived who investigators thought may have custody of Tylee and JJ, but ultimately there was no indication either child was in Arizona. In early December, he was investigating Alex for the shooting, and they were watching and tracking him 24/7. They learned he was back in Gilbert. And then we know on December 12th, Alex died. The same day he died, they executed search warrants on his house and his vehicle. In the home, they found firearms and munitions, identification, clothing. There were literature and books by Chad Daybell. And in his truck, they found holsters, ammunition, and a copy of that patriarchal blessing authored by Chad Daybell to Alex Cox. On cross, Pryor asked, would you agree the common denominator in all these matters is Alex and Lori? The witness says for the Gilbert investigation, yes. For Charles's murder, it's Alex and Lori and not Chad. The witness says yes. The next person on the stand just before lunch is Deputy Coulter Cannon. He got a call about the attempt on Tammy Daybell. They played the 911 call made by Tammy's son-in-law, Joseph Murray, and then they also played the 911 call placed by Tammy. It was dusk when this happened. He was only a couple of miles away when he got the call, and at this point, they break for lunch. So this evening, I'll bring you the afternoon testimony broken down in an hour or less to keep you updated. Until then, hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon. We'll see you soon.